Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. I'm here with Dan Fitzpatrick. Now, Dan, you're a pioneering figure in the realm of artificial intelligence in education. You have a book out, and that's a national bestseller, and it's called The AI Classroom: Teaching and Learning in the Artificial Intelligence Revolution. Your contributions in the field have garnered significant acclaim, including the prestigious Tech Champion Award and the Digital Industry Dynamite Awards in 2022, and recognition amongst the distinguished EdTech 50 awards. Previously, you've held influential positions, such as the Director of Digital Strategy at Educational Partnership Northeast and a senior leadership role in a secondary school. You're currently the helm of Third Box Limited, guiding your organization as the director, and your academic journey, encompassing an MA from Durham University and PGCE from UCL, as well as a postgraduate diploma in design thinking and innovation from MIT, has equipped you with a profound understanding and skill set vital for navigating the dynamic intersection of AI in education. Dan, you've been featured in various media platforms like Good Morning Britain, Time Magazine, BBC, and ITV New. And now you're being featured on our podcast, Innovations in Public Education. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's really good to be with you. Just ending the day here. I'm in the UK, so just brought my 5 and 4-year-olds. We just took them to Taekwondo class, and now we've just got home. So I'm glad I can finish the day off talking to you.
Well, we're really glad to have you here, Dan. And your background has been really focused on this notion of artificial intelligence and the future of learning. So let me start off with what brought you to AI? And then let's talk a little bit about what role AI will play in the future of teaching and learning. So how did you get to AI and your interest in that work?
It goes back probably about 15, 16 years when I was doing MA from Durham University, which is a university in the northeast of England. I had a lecturer who was really obsessed with technology, obsessed with kind of the future of learning and technology. And I remember him recommending this book, and it was a book by an author called M.T. Anderson called Feed. And it was I think it was like a teenage novel. So it was very easy to read. And it was all about kind of a future in a few decades' time where when everybody's born, they get a computer chip inserted into their head. And that's how they interact with the world. So through an almost augmented reality, they can communicate with people through this and see the world through it. And I remember just being fascinated by this book and really catching my attention and starting really to explore the technology then. Anyway, when I became a teacher, and ever since my first year of training to be a teacher, I really got into cloud computing. I remember going to a session where we were being shown Google Drive. I think it was just before Google Classroom was launched, maybe. So we were shown Google Drive and kind of the capabilities, and it just seemed like a no-brainer to me. Why aren't we using this? Why isn't this just a standard tool within education? Because if the dream is that our students can access learning from anywhere at any time and can have that kind of personalization to a certain level as it was, then why aren't we using it? So I became, ever since my first year of training to be a teacher, a bit of an evangelist around cloud technology and educational technology, and kind of loved that world really. And started to work the conferences for Google and do bits outside of my job. And I suppose anybody who kind of gets into educational technology, it doesn't take long before your gaze starts to turn onto the future of education. And you start to look at, well, technology is so rapidly changing and developing that you kind of have no choice but to go, well, if we do hook what we're doing onto technology or we use it in some way and it keeps advancing, then how are we going to have to rethink education? How are we going to have to look at things afresh? Especially in an education system, which is a few hundred years old now, was built for a different time. So how maybe could we start doing things better? And so I started a podcast about 6 years ago with a friend of mine called EduFuturists. Every week we talk to a pioneer from around the world who was doing it differently, who was taking education and thinking, actually, we can probably do it better and doing something better. And that just kind of captured my imagination, really. So it was always kind of a side project. And then when I was working in college education, I moved into college education. I came across a tool I was writing a strategy at the time, and I was going into local businesses and industries and looking at what's the cutting edge technology that we might be able to use within the curriculum, within preparing our students for the future of work, and started to hear people refer to this technology as a calculator for words, and it got my attention. And this was pre ChatGPT, and we started to look at language models in terms of how could it help our lecturers mark work, give feedback. Very, very early days, and we were looking using it even just to look for keywords within a larger piece of work to kind of give an indication of how well the student was doing. And then, end of November, I mean, pretty much 2 years ago, OpenAI released ChatGPT, and very early days, I played with it. I think the first day it was released, I started playing with it and seeing what it could do. There wasn't really anybody on my social media channels talking about it at all. In fact, there was nobody in the first few days. And then think I saw like one negative comment about it from an education point of view. And I just kind of thought, actually, this is not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing this as being a potential benefit for education. So I started putting content out there and helping teachers discover this, and kind of, yeah, went from there. Wrote the book that you kindly mentioned earlier and went from there.
So, Dan, it sounds like you were always on kind of cutting edge of technology in terms of education, and educational technologies kind of had a mixed bag, right? You have some ed tech folks who are envisioning disrupting all education through AI, where there would not be a need for public schools, maybe not a computer chip. Let's go Matrix style, right? Just I know Kung Fu. Take me through this idea of what AI will do to the learning process, the teaching process, and teachers themselves. I just came from the Urban Assembly Institute for Math and Science. We're releasing a new product around teacher feedback. And one of the concerns some of our teachers had are like, you're trying to replace teachers. You want students to learn from AI instead of learning from people. But I know that's not your take on this. Tell our audience what you think about this work.
Yeah, I always remember when people say that. I remember a good friend of mine called David Price, who's sadly no longer with us. He wrote a book about 5 years ago called Open, How We Work and Learn in the Future, I think it was called. And I remember him always saying, if a teacher can be replaced by a YouTube video, then they probably should be replaced by a YouTube video.
Mm.
And his whole point was, if we're feeling threatened, we didn't have ChatGPT. This is a few years ago now, and people were talking about, well, people just being able to learn anything they want from YouTube. And his whole point was, well, if what we're doing as a teacher is on the same level as a YouTube video, then of course get worried about it. Of course.
Mm.
And I think the same sentiment can be applied to something like, especially at the moment, ChatGPT. If you equate what you're doing to a ChatGPT conversation, then that's probably more of a reflection on you than the actual tool. In educators, I work with educators all around the world, and we don't do what ChatGPT does. ChatGPT can't replace what we do. It's so much more there, where we teach within environments that offer so much more than just passing knowledge.
That's right.
Or answering questions. And to be honest, I was just talking to your producer before we went on air, and I was talking about how the English education system is very traditional. And even more so, kind of in the last decade or so, we've almost gone back to more traditional method, where it is kind of transfer of knowledge, and the more creative sides of school have kind of been left by the wayside. I mean, a lot of the time because of just lack of resources and lack of time in the timetable to get through so much curriculum. And I suppose that's what worries me, I think, if we just see schooling as a way to prepare students for an exam, for example,
Mhm.
where we're going to go, right, I've got so much content I need to teach to you. You need to learn it, and you need to show me you've learned it so that you can go into an exam hall and then demonstrate it. And then we're all good. Then we get the grades. I keep my job. You get a good grade. School gets a good rating, and we're all good. I think if we just treat school in that streamlined, minimalist way,
Mhm.
then maybe we do have something to be worried about from AI. And I think what we've got to do, we've got to go on a journey of self-reflection where we go, what can we offer that's different?
Mhm.
What can we offer that isn't just that two-dimensional transfer of knowledge? And I think we can offer so much more. We do offer so much more. And I think we're just going to have to probably tune into that a
Mm.
bit more. And my hope as well is that the AI, the automation side of these tools, will actually help us to spend a bit more time on the kind of human side of education.
Mhm.
Because if we are moving into a world of ubiquitous AI, where AI is going to be all around us, we're all using AI, then we're going to need more humanity in our lives. We're going to need to unshackle ourselves from the computer, to see ourselves as different from a cog in a machine, and focus more on that human side. And I think what it's going to do is it's going to force us to rethink Well, what do our students need to learn? And not just what do they need to learn, but who do they need to become? What type of people do they need to become? And then we become guides on that journey, I think. I love the term seminary. So it's normally referred to in the religious context. So seminary tends to be like a college where people go to train to be priests or ministers. But the word seminary means seedbed. To get back to looking at schools almost like as a seedbed and how we help our young people grow and form, I think it's going to be a much more healthier way to view education.
Let's spend some time on this notion of a timetable because in your book, you actually spend a lot of time thinking about how to save teachers time. You have this notion of like teaching and learning, but you also have this like very practical approach of like, how can I help you save time so that you can do things that drive high quality interactions that develop the whole person? So let me just come back to you on this notion, the timetable, AI, solutions, and how do we make teaching more efficient so that the actual teaching and learning process can be elevated?
Yeah, I think even just that word timetable is very. I know some schools that have scrap timetables
Mhm.
and I look at their school day completely different. And we just talked about how education goes back to a bygone time, an industrial time, where literally the ring of the bell, the moving from one station to another is very much that factory model. So, how do we reinvent education for a world of now where people have a lot more autonomy and freedom? And how do we allow students to work at their own pace? I think it's going to be really interesting. But going back to kind of the saving time element, very simply, one of the main reasons why I started sharing content around AI was I was one of those people who always thought, well, one day of my weekend's always a work day. It would normally be a Sunday, and I
Mhm.
wasn't getting paid for it. Kind of wasn't expected, but it was needed. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to function during the week if I hadn't spent that day planning, preparing, grading work, writing feedback. And I just kind of took it as a norm. If I'm going to be a teacher, then Sunday is going to be a work day. And I missed times with families. I was in this room while my family was downstairs working. And I suddenly realized that some of these tools could actually save that valuable time and just help a teacher get their personal time back.
Let me push back on this, Dan, because
Yeah.
you're talking to another guest, and there's a notion, I think, right now, some places in teaching, and it's like, if you're not suffering, you're not doing it right. You know, I'm not going to do AI for feedback because I gotta grade every single paper, right? I gotta write every single lesson. And if I don't do that, I'm not really doing the real teaching thing. I haven't earned my blood scars, as it were. So push back on that for me. Like, should you have to
um,
spend a
I
day
mean,
on your weekend doing work to be a good teacher?
I suppose if you want to be a martyr for the cause, then you can. I mean, no one's going to stop you. But
Maybe
I
your
think
spouse, right?
yeah, exactly, yeah. But I've known teachers like that. I suppose I was kind of one of those teachers myself, and yeah, it's I think there's probably a reason why I know here in the UK why a third of teachers leave within their first 5 years. That
So
the teaching profession has something like the highest level of marital affairs. Like there's a lot of pressures put on people in those circumstances, and I think if you want to be someone who spends all your time at work, all your time doing work, that's completely fine. I don't think it needs to be that way though. And I don't think it should be that way because when you stand with a class, do you want to be refreshed? Do you want to be on form? Do you want to be the teacher running at near 100% energy and ready to go? Or do you want to be a teacher who's literally been up all night, putting those hours in, hasn't really rested at the weekend because you're literally dotting the I's and crossing the T's on absolutely everything. And when I used to work with trainee teachers, I used to always say to them, and let me qualify because it sounds bad at first, but I always said that if you want to make it full time in the teaching profession, you're going to have to learn how to cut corners because there's so much put on teachers. There's so many tasks
yeah.
that if you don't, you're just going to have a breakdown. There's no way that you can survive if you do everything that's tasked to you.
I had a
So,
teacher who I was working with over at the Urban Assembly, and she said, "David, you know what I learned?" I was like, "Tell me." She said, like, "If there's not a follow-up email, probably can put this on the not that
yeah,
that
yeah,
important priority," you know, because she was really struggling to have to deal with all the tasks that were put on her, and she started coming up with her own system. And when you say cut corners, like, it's not about doing less, it's about prioritizing the right things, right?
yeah,
Because everything will come at you. So So now make the connection to me back to AI, right? Because like again, not about cutting corners, but being the kind of teacher that allows you to do the work and show up in this actual teaching and learning process.
Yeah, and again, like you say, that cutting corners, it's not about a lack of quality. It's not about sacrificing the quality. It's about actually sacrificing some of the quantity so that you can put the quality where you need it to be.
Let's go. I hear
And I think it's the same for AI, like you just connected there, that if we use this in the right way, and I emphasize the right way, then this can actually help us again do the things that need the quality a bit better.
you.
It's a bit of a cliche, but I suppose if you take like pairing a learning experience for a class compared to, I don't know, writing an admin document that needs to be done for the school website or something like that, then clearly the learning experience is by far the most important thing.
Mm.
But actually writing this document for your school website, let's say, could actually take more time because you're not doing it that often. It needs a bit more attention because it's not kind of the job you normally do. Whereas the learning experience is what you do. It's your passion. You've got resources. You've got ideas. So if AI could help with that admin task, for example, and help you just form it a bit more. I use AI. I write an article every week for Forbes, and I use AI a lot. I mean, it doesn't write it for me, but what it does is it helps me form a structure. It will help me. I'll use a tool like Google Notebook LM to pull out some source material that I can use inside the article. And then it brings all that together. And then I might even go, give me a first draft. Let's see what it could look like as an article. And then because I'm very much the type of person who, if I'm going to put something out in public, it has to be my own work. I will then go in and use it as a bit of inspiration and reword it, make it my own completely. But if AI can help, I don't know, let's say 50% of that admin task, and that admin task was going to take 2 hours, that's a full extra hour you've got to really hone in,
Yeah.
either really hone in and make that learning experience even better, or make sure that the night before you're well rested so that when you go into that to deliver that learning experience, your energy is a lot better. You're a lot more in gear to be there and be present to those students. I think sometimes AI gets a bad rap for going, oh, well, you're just going to get AI to write it for you. Or you're just going to get AI to do it for you. But that's not what this is. It's about collaborating with AI, remaining as the thinker. I wrote a chapter in that book called Outsource Your Doing, Not Your Thinking. So you, no matter what you're getting AI to do, you want to remain at the center as the main thinker, the main agent within that. At the moment, anyway, and we can go into how that might change, because I'm sure as AI advances, all this conversation will probably have to be slightly reframed as we go. But at the moment, we want to stay there as the main thinker. We want to be in control. I often say to teachers, imagine your principal says to you, we're going to hire someone and they're just going to be for you. And they're going to write a first draft of everything for you.
Mhm.
So no matter what you're doing, you're giving feedback, you're writing reports, whatever you're doing, you just say, right, I need a first draft. In 10 minutes, you've got a first draft.
Kind of like what a CEO does, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I often say that. So especially if I'm talking to like districts or full schools, I'll say, right, who has a personal assistant? And sometimes the CEO or the superintendent has somebody who does that kind of thing for them. I'm like, well, why do we feel guilty about having one when literally the person at the top of your organization's got one? And Mike don't just have one, might have a team of them. And I think it's almost like nobody's put it in the context for us of going, well, you don't have to, coming back to kind of the martyr situation that we talked about just earlier, you don't have to like slog away,
Mm.
like literally sweat blood for your work when there's something that can help you. And that, I mean, that's what anyone who owns a business, anyone who's an entrepreneur, anyone who's ever hired someone in their life is hiring that person because they recognize that they can't do it all. Imagine the CEO of a business saying, I'm not going to hire anyone, I'm going to do it all myself. This is my work. Like, I'm going to do all the marketing, I'm going to do the finance, I'm going to do my own accounts. Like, people would say, you're crazy. Like, get an accountant, get someone who specializes in marketing. But for some reason, as a teacher, we kind of feel like, well, it all has to go on our shoulders, and we have to take that weight completely.
Yeah.
And we don't have to, and especially now that we've never had, I mean, we might have classroom assistants, but we've never had like an admin assistant as a teacher because it's just not economically viable. But now we've got a system where you can spend $20 a month on something like ChatGPT. So what's that? In over a year, that's $240 for the year, you can get a tool that will help write a first draft for you that you can communicate with and get better at and get it to help you with things. Now, again, it's a first draft. Nobody uses a first draft, but it's there to do that first overlook of maybe offer some feedback for your students to write that report for you, and then you go in and make it your own. But if that cuts down that task by 50%, maybe even it just does 10% of it, that's 10% back and it's all starts to add up. So I think it's interesting. The efficiency, the time saving is low hanging fruit when it comes to these tools, but it's still really important. I think it's still really important. Now, I think AI will go much further, and that's kind of what your book's about, and kind of going, because I very much see innovation in two ways. And when I was studying for my postgraduate diploma in innovation, I studied under a guy called Vijay Govindarajan, and he talked about innovation as linear innovation and non-linear. So linear innovation being, well, how do we improve what we've already got?
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we look at something like AI as to help us with efficiency, time saving, we're essentially going, right, well, how do we use AI to just help us get a little bit better or save a bit more time in our current way of doing things? Same goal at the end of the day, the same success metrics, same systems, processes, but we're just using a tool to help us do it a bit better, I guess. And I suppose that's how the education system is normally innovated, especially within things like EdTech. A new EdTech tool comes along. Does it help support what we're already doing?
Right.
If it doesn't, we probably don't want it. If it does, we'll squeeze it in somewhere, we'll tag it on, and we'll forget about it most of the time. But or it'll really help, and it'll get streamlined into kind of what we do. Now, I think there's a problem here in that, what if there's something external disrupts our current way of doing things?
Mm-hmm.
Then just tagging more AI onto it isn't going to actually help. Just getting a bit more efficient at something that is maybe becoming irrelevant isn't actually going to help. Now, I'm not saying the education system is going to become irrelevant, but parts of it could.
Let's hang on to that. What are we trying to accomplish in our public education system?
Yeah, good question.
What's going to be relevant and what's going to be disrupted in terms of your vision and of how AI is going to move through the system?
Well, yeah, and I think that question you just asked is so important. I don't think we know the answer to it, and that's a big part of the problem. Someone asked me on a podcast the other day, if I was in charge of the Department for Education in the UK for one day, what would I do with that day? And I was like, right, I'd get a bunch of people together and go, what is the purpose of education? What are we doing? Why are we doing it?
Yeah.
Because I think if you ask every single teacher, every single educational leader, you'll get a different answer.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem, because then how do we know whether we're achieving something?
Mhm.
And so by default, the purpose becomes whatever we measure.
The metric, right?
Yeah,
It's the testing, right?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
in the UK, it's grades pretty much. And it's what we have a government body that inspects schools called Ofsted.
Ofsted. Yes, I
Yeah,
remember.
a well-loved organization in the
Oh,
UK.
deeply appreciated in schools across the UK.
So it comes down to exam grades and Ofsted grades.
Yeah.
And so that becomes the purpose then. But when there's a vacuum, those measurements then just become the purpose. So I think we need to go, right, what do we want? I think a simple purpose for education is preparing students to be successful in their lives. I mean, very basic.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean not just successful in work, but successful in life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Work is a big part of life, but it's within life. And I think we then have to, I think if we almost got together and said, right, let's pretend that an education system doesn't exist. We've never educated.
I got one for you on this. Ready?
I think that
Tomorrow we're starting a colony on Mars. Okay. Now go back to you, right? So we don't have an education system. We got to start one from scratch, right? What do we teach and why?
I think then we have to go, well, what is a successful life? And there's loads of things. I mean, philosophers have pondered this question for millennia and millennia.
A long time. What's a good life, right?
And I'm sure we can come up with something where we can agree kind of roughly on what does a successful life be? What does a successful life mean in your 20s, in your 30s, in your 40s, your 50s, your 60s? Because it'll obviously mean something different. And then how do we prepare our students to be successful through those ages of their lives?
Mm-hmm.
And this is my new book's called Infinite Education. And this is the premise of it. It's kind of saying, well, how does education go past the finite and into helping people for the rest of their lives?
Mm.
And I think we need to go back to that kind of those basic principles really, and of going, right, well, then how do we do that? Let's say we look back down on earth and go, right, how's schooling done there? Well, they just split all the knowledge into 10 core subjects and they just tell kids about it and then test what the kids have retained. I think we'd probably sit around and go, yeah, I think we can do better than that.
The reason why I think the Mars example is interesting, and I want you to hang with me a little bit on this, because like they did the study and they were looking at, all right, like first of all, what's the hardest part of getting people to Mars? Apparently, not technology. Apparently, sitting together for 6 months between Earth and Mars, that's the hardest part. People, they're gonna fight. Then we land on Mars, right? What do you do with weirdos, right? We're hanging out, we're hanging out, we're hanging out. We're not getting along. There's no place to go,
Yeah.
right? So a lot of the problem sets that NASA has been looking at is like these interpersonal spaces. Like, how do you work together? If you don't farm, Potato the Martian, if you don't do your work, we're not going to eat. Right. So, like, these very basic, how do we get along? And then also, what do we need to know to reproduce human society? So, I just want to throw this back to you, Dan. Let's go with the infinite, right? Like, if we needed to reproduce human society on a different planet, like what were the things that would motivate our educational system to get after?
As you were talking, I was thinking as well, like, what happens when, I don't know, when the spaceship gets a hole in it? Like, we're going to have to do a bit of problem solving there. We're going to have to think outside the box. We're going to have to be ready for that. We're going to
Yeah.
have frameworks in place to take us through the system of thinking of a solution. And that's a whole skill. I think a lot of people think problem solving is just something that somebody who thinks outside the box can do. It's
Yeah.
like innovation. I often say to people that, you do know, innovation isn't just like the maverick in your organization who suddenly has a bright idea one day. Innovation's an actual skill. You can literally train to be an innovator,
Mm,
and you can learn the frameworks of how to go through the process to innovate and to be consistently innovative as well, not just a bright idea every now and then. So
mm.
how do we actually pass on these skills? How do we prepare them for whatever's happening around? Because I don't know, maybe we get to Mars and some aliens pop out of a cave and we're like, oh my goodness, we didn't expect this. But actually,
And we can't go home, so we can figure this out, right?
exactly. But you can be prepared without knowing everything.
Yeah, yeah.
I love the idea of our schooling system is we've kind of got a model of just in case education. It's like,
Mhm,
right, 4 years old, come into class until you're 18. We're just going to expose you to so much knowledge
mhm,
just in case at some point in the future you might ever need it.
mm,
And it's like, how much do you actually remember of that? Very little. But actually, if we turned it around and thought, well, what about a just in time model? What if
mm.
we, you know what, here's the problem. Now let's gather the resources and solve that problem. And then the preparation isn't the knowledge, the preparation is the skills to deal with it. It's actually putting the horse in front of the cart rather than the other way around, which we seem to be doing a lot at the minute, and going, well, actually, what's the purpose of the education? Well, maybe it's to solve a problem in the immediate sense. Maybe this town has a homeless shelter that's shutting down, and the town's in crisis because there's nowhere these homeless people are going to go. And maybe it's literally the teacher reading about that in the newspaper, coming into school the next day and going, right, we got a problem to solve. What do we need to know? Skills are we going to need to have? What resources do we need? And then that's when you get to a position where you go, right, actually, the school timetable doesn't really fit that model anymore.
Mhm.
It just doesn't work. I mean, imagine that at work. Imagine you sat down for an hour and you were doing some deep, intensive thinking and working, and then all of a sudden a bell went, you had to go and do something else for an hour. Then a bell went, you had to go do something else for an hour.
Yeah,
Drive you crazy.
yeah, yeah.
Get to the end of the day and think, I haven't actually properly achieved anything.
That's when I wave my folks off at my office. Stand by, stand by. It's all
Yeah,
about,
yeah.
you know?
This is like sometimes you need to sit down at your desk for 3 hours before the good stuff starts coming. Like you got to
Yeah.
just get yourself into that process. Sometimes it happens quite quickly. It's just part of the process.
I just want to take a second on this. I want to pull out one of your ideas here. So I think one of the interesting things about like neural networks and as they were developed for generative AI is that they were based on how humans learn, right? And now we're not embodied neurons that are taking in content and making connections. We're people with agency and ambitions and emotional states. But going back to this idea of like, okay, we use content during an AI to create relationships with information. I'm saying the AI system, right? And humans do something similar. But there's a way of thinking about learning that says that this content creates the conditions for us to problem solve by giving us the baseline of information and knowledge by which to use to make connections and understand ourselves in the world. And then there's another version that says the purpose of knowledge or information is in the moment being able to access it effectively in order to pull that back up to problem solve. So I want to throw this out to you, right? Because there are two different ways of thinking about knowledge and the role of knowledge in problem solving. And I just want to get a sense, like, where do you see knowledge and content in problem solving in terms of real people?
I've seen examples of both, really. I think it depends on the person a large amount of the time. I like the idea as well of kind of the nuance there,
Yeah,
especially with language model and how that works, because the human brain polarizes things because it's an easy way to sort and kind of go, right, well, that belongs there. And then we feel like we've got a handle on it and we can move on to the next thing. And it's,
sure.
but actually, most things in life are nuanced. So we suddenly go to, like, back to your example from earlier, of, is this going to replace me?
Yeah.
And I suppose in that example you just said, will this even just solve the problem for me?
Mm,
I just type in, we got this issue, and then I get a readout of what the answer is. But I suppose that's not how problem solving works. Problem
yeah.
solving, anybody who's done any design thinking, for example,
Yeah.
you can have the best minds in the world around the table coming up with ideas. But unless you prototype them, unless you actually test them in the real world,
Yeah.
you've got no idea if they're going to work or not. There has to be a sense of working with AI.
Mm.
We know language models can come up with some amazing solutions. I mean, there was a study done by a group of colleges in the United States last year. They found that they specifically was better at coming up with more innovative ideas than a group of human beings.
And then there's a recent one looking at diagnoses for doctors, which is a more kind of like
Oh yeah,
concrete problem set. But I didn't know about this one about problem solving and kind of ideation.
yeah. I think it was from the first half of 2023. And I suppose if you think, what is creativity? What is innovation?
Mm.
There's a theory out there that says, well, we can't actually come up with anything new. Like that's just, and then they say the people who come up with the best ideas are people who can dwell on information,
Mhm.
just let things in their heads bounce off each other. And I think that seems to be how we come up with new ideas, where you can take different areas of your life and just let different ideas from completely unrelated spheres of your life bounce off each other and see what you get and see what different angles. And I suppose in that sense, it's all just information bouncing off each other. And if you look at an LLM, a machine that's just been trained on a hell of a lot of information,
Yeah.
you keep playing with it enough, you keep bouncing different random ideas of each other over and over again. Those who use a tool like ChatGPT will know it. Like, you got to keep going at it. You got to keep digging and digging, and that's when you start getting the good stuff. And I really get fascinated by the fact that this is a collaborator.
I hear that.
I was talking to, Jaguar Land Rover, the car company, who are
Yeah. Yeah.
based here in the UK.
I've heard of them.
Their design teams are the guys who come together and design the next Land Rover, for example. They use AI imaging. We've been using it for about 3 years now. They were saying that the AI imaging probably does about 80% of the work now.
Mm.
They have to train it. They have to feed it with kind of, what does a Land Rover look like? What are the rules? This is kind of it can't just look like any car. It has to have the style guidelines, all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Wouldn't they just go, right, let's just play with it and see what comes
Right.
out? Out of 100 or maybe even 1,000 iterations, they might see something where a curve or an angle on the front of the car, and they think, oh, that actually looks really good. Maybe we could incorporate that.
Yeah.
They've got to dig with that. They've got to keep digging and digging. So using it as an idea partner,
Yeah.
I think a sparring partner is fascinating. I do that quite a bit with, ChatGPT's got the voice feature now where you can
I
just
do. Yeah.
just push it, keep pushing it. And sometimes I'll be working and I'll just have it on and I'll just be talking to it back and forth and just keep
Yeah.
pushing and see. And again, 99 times out of 100, it'll be things where I think it'll either be really obvious stuff. It'll be things where I'm like, I could have thought of that myself. But then maybe one time out of 100, I'm like, actually, there's something there.
Right.
I
Right.
could maybe take that and incorporate it into what I was doing. And I think, to be fair, it's not too different. We've always done that.
Yeah.
Like, but before we had to go to the library, we had to read 100 books, and then we had to then consolidate the learning. And
We're always interacting with something, right? And I think that
yeah,
that's one of the key things that I've been listening to you kind of lay out is how do we interact with people, knowledge, books, AI in a way that spurs our thinking creativity, right? Just sitting with your own thoughts is one thing. And this is where I think when you talk about these things bouncing around, that foundational space on like how much information do we have to bounce around? And then how do we access more? We use AI, we use folks like you, right? Who we're just having a conversation about. And then we start to think about, okay, idea one, idea two, idea three. Let's start to layer them on top of each other to come up with a new idea that's kind of a composite of all the inputs.
Yeah, I think you're so right. In fact, it's one of the reasons why I really like doing podcasts, because I try not to come on with notes or anything. I'm kind of doing podcasts at the minute to talk about my new book, but I literally don't have notes and there's no paper here. I've literally just got my laptop open. And I like just having the conversation, because as I'm talking and listening to what you're saying and just talking off the top of my head, some of it might not sound like fully formed thoughts because I'm just literally doing this off the top of my head. I'm trying to rethink things at the same time. I might say something, or you might say something, or we might come to a conclusion together where I'm like, actually, that's really good. And that connects to something I've just written about. And that might spur on an article at the weekend that I write. So it's really good to be able, because I suppose a podcast, the reason I give podcast an example is because a podcast is quite an intense hour where
Yeah.
you're talking to someone who's like-minded, you're trying to go deep, whereas that doesn't happen in just day-to-day conversations all of the
Yeah.
time. Otherwise, life would just be crazy intense. So it's nice to be able to do this. And I suppose, like you say, it's what we've always done with other human beings, maybe in our work environment. It's what we've done with a book. We've connected with somebody else's mind through the words they've written, and it makes us think and shape it in different ways. And I suppose using a tool that can simulate human language back to us, using the knowledge that's out there in the world, is just another way, I guess. But it's a bit more accessible. It's a bit more bespoke to us. It's a bit easier to use. I don't have to put as much effort into it, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I know some people at that, going back to the martyrs analogy earlier, some people think, well, you got to give your all to get something out of this
It's gotta
world.
hurt. It's gotta hurt.
And I get that. And I think you do to a certain degree. Like, learning there has to be friction, doesn't there, for learning to happen? But it doesn't have to be painful friction every second of every day. It can be enjoyable. It doesn't have to feel like work. It can be an easy conversation. And sometimes AI allows us that. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's useless at certain things. But some things it can be really good and assist us.
Well, speaking of great conversations, I've really had a great conversation here with you today. We've talked about how you came to AI. We've talked about your new book. And where can folks find your book if they're interested in diving more into your mind?
Yeah. So the first book, The AI Classroom, which has been out about a year and a half now, which is very practical for teachers in the classroom. The new book is all about innovators, those who are leaders and those who want to lead into the future. And how do we rethink education? It's a very practical book. It's called Infinite Education, the 4-step strategy for change in an age of artificial intelligence. And it's all kind of what we were talking about before, about how actually AI is going to help us with the here and now, but also we might have to rethink what we do within education in an AI world eventually. And how do we start to prepare for that? And how do we get a group of people together to help us start looking at that, innovating around that? And I'm very conscious in the book that that's difficult for all the reasons we've said, the strapped resources, the lack of time. So it gives like lots of little practical tips of how to innovate within the restrictions that we function under, really. So yeah, it's called Infinite Education. It's out 6th of January. So people listening to this might already be out, and you can get it at Amazon, Barnes and Noble, wherever you get your books from.
Well, Dan, thank you for all your work. We appreciate your vision for the future with regards to what it means to be educated, the role AI can play in it. And folks, you heard it right here. You can get Dan's new book coming out in January, and also the books that he's put out with regards to innovation in public education with the use of AI. Appreciate you, Dan.
Thank you very much, David.
Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams, and have a great day.